Good evening. I'm Theo Brown, Director of McClendon Scholar Program. We're pleased you're joining us for this evening. We're going to begin the webinar in a couple of minutes, but want to give just a little more time for participants to gather. We have almost 700 people registered and want as many as possible to be able to sign on before we begin. As we're waiting, I want to point out a couple of functions you can access at the bottom of your screen that we'll be using later in the program. There's a Q&A icon that you just rub your cursor over that, you'll see near the bottom, and I'll explain later how we'll be using it tonight. There's also a chat function which allows you to share comments and see comments from other people. We won't have this on during the main part of the program, but we'll enable it a couple of times during the evening. In fact, we've turned it on now, I believe, so you can sort of practice. And also we want to ask you a question. We know that most people joining us tonight are from the Washington, D.C. area, but we also know people have signed on from many other locations. And take a minute now and practice in the chat, and particularly if you're from out of the D.C. area, and type in where you are as you listen to and participate in this program this evening. And also, maybe a word about how you heard about the program, particularly if you're out of town. But take a moment, let's see what people say. We're starting to see people from several places, Chapel Hill, Boyce, Virginia, someone calling the Washington, D.C. the Douglas Commonwealth. I love that. Needham, Massachusetts, we have someone. We have just all kinds of folks coming in. Wilmington, Delaware. I see some folks from Manhattan. We have quite a virtual community here from lots of different locations. Detroit. Many more are coming in as people sign on. Continue to type in. I see Ithaca, New York. Someone on Martha's Vineyard. That sounds like a good place to be for this. And someone from Adams Morgan, the neighborhood in Washington, D.C. area close to my heart. So it's a great mix. Keep typing it in. We're curious to see, and we'll collect all of these later. Again, we're just really glad that you've joined us this evening. We'll be back in just a moment to start the webinar. You'll have a welcome from Reverend Heather Shortledge from New York Avenue Presbyterian in just a moment when we begin.
Good evening and welcome. I am Reverend Heather Shortledge, transitional pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. We cannot gather in the sanctuary tonight due to the coronavirus. So instead, we gather here online for this very important two-part conversation. After the protests, what do we do now? Now, I have to admit that I'm a bit troubled by the preposition used in tonight's title. Using the word after could indicate that the protests are behind us, finished, something in the past. And yet we know that even as we gather here tonight on our screens, there are still people raising their voices and their fists in the streets. At Black Lives Matter Plaza, there is still storytelling and marching, artwork, and midnight yoga sessions. The sacred resistance continues. And in Wisconsin, as residents refuse to ignore yet another Black man shot 7 times in the back at close range by police. His name is Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old father of 3 who will likely never walk again. The protests have not stopped and hopefully will not stop, but tonight, the hope, the intention, is to begin a serious conversation about what happens next. Concrete steps that you and I and our friends and neighbors can start to be about, so that the punitive, unjust world that has been created, that is stacked against the most vulnerable and devastating for anyone without white skin, that world can begin to be dismantled and torn down and ended, and a more just, equitable, and decent society can be built in its place. For those of you who are Christians, it is our call, this work of doing justice and loving kindness, this work of actively seeking for our neighbor what we want for ourselves. Tonight's conversation is important because we know that a single election will not solve these problems. These systems were built over time, and it will take time to tear them down and rebuild them. So tonight we gather to listen, to learn, to strategize, and to act. We are thrilled that you have joined us tonight, as well as our distinguished speaker, James Forman Jr., professor at Yale Law School, and local pastor, Reverend Joe Daniels of Emory Methodist Church. On behalf of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, we are honored to have you in our midst. And now, as we enter into tonight's program, may God's Holy Spirit disturb what needs disturbing, interrupt what needs interrupting, and stir up what needs stirring up.
Thank you, Heather. Again, I'm Theo Brown, the director of the McClendon Scholar Program. I want to add my word of welcome. Even in these days of restricted activities, you still have lots of choices about what to do this evening, and we're glad you decided to spend time with us. We're having this webinar and a follow-up one on September 3rd, near the end of what has been a summer filled with protests and pledges to change the criminal justice system. As Heather indicated, some protests indeed are still going on, but earlier this summer there was an unprecedented outpouring of protests. The New York Times said they likely were the largest set of protests in American history, and that maybe as many as 23 million people may have participated directly. That's really a remarkable number, and I imagine that many who are watching here are among those who took the streets during these past months. And now that the main part of the protests have subsided, though others go on in response to recent outrages and other concerns, in some ways the hard part begins now, as concerned people who really want to see change must take ongoing action to make it happen. Tonight, we're going to be challenged to do that by our featured speaker, James Forman Jr., who will talk about some of the factors that have created the injustices in our system and lay out some suggestions about what could be done. I'll introduce him to you more formally in a moment. After his presentation, as Heather said, we're glad to be joined by Reverend Joe Daniels of Emory Methodist Church up on Georgia Avenue in the Brightwood neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And he will respond with some brief comments and engage in conversation with Mr. Forman about issues that have been raised. Joe Daniels is a community leader who's engaged in many efforts to promote justice in Washington, D.C., and we're really pleased he's joining us tonight. We will also have another prominent local pastor, Reverend William Lamar of Metropolitan AME, who will be joining us as part of the program on September 3rd. In order to help you get more effectively involved in some of these issues we'll be discussing, we'll be sharing information at a couple times throughout the evening about groups and organizations that are actively engaged in working to improve our criminal justice system. Some are national organizations, some work more at the local level. Many of the ones we're going to mention are specifically focused on Washington, D.C. area, but let me remind those of you from out of town that similar organizations exist in almost every city in the country. Now, we're pleased to have lots of different kinds of people joining us tonight. Many of you are from congregations, others from community organizations, some work in the private sector, others work for government, and I know some of you are associated with particular activist groups. And I think we'll be making suggestions of how to get involved that'll work for pretty much everyone. At the same time, I know from looking at the registration list that we have lots of lawyers and law students who've registered for this program. And that's very good because some of these organizations are in particular need of various types of pro bono legal help. And I hope you who have legal experience or legal education pay particular attention to these opportunities. There'll also be a couple of times when you'll have a chance for direct input into the program. We'll have a general question and answer period after Joe Daniels and James Forman engage in a conversation. And then again, near the end of the program, we're gonna open up chat again and invite you to make some comments at that point. Now, the Q&A feature will be open throughout. So as you listen to James Forman as he speaks and then to the dialogue with him, feel free to type in a question if one occurs to you that you'd like him to comment on. And I also want to point out that there is a like feature with the question and answer function on this webinar, so that if you look at the questions and there's one you particularly like, feel free to click like, and as a question gathers multiple likes, it lets us know there's interest in it and that we should do everything we can to try to make sure that question gets answered. As we start later, I'll remind you about the Q&A function when we get into that part here in a few minutes. It's now my privilege to introduce James Forman Jr. to you. James Forman Jr. is a nationally known critic of mass incarceration and the disproportionate impact it has had on people of color. James Forman Jr. graduated from Atlanta's Roosevelt High School, attended Brown University, and then Yale Law School. After law school, he worked as a law clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor at the U.S. Supreme Court. After clerking, he joined the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., probably not the most common career path for former Supreme Court clerks, where for 6 years he represented juveniles and adults in felony and misdemeanor cases. Professor Forman loved being a public defender, but he quickly became frustrated with a lack of education and job training opportunities for his clients. So in 1997, along with David Domenici, he started the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, an alternative school for dropouts and youth who had been previously arrested. A decade later, in 2007, Maya Angelou School expanded and agreed to run the school inside the DC's juvenile prison. At Yale Law School, where he's taught since 2011, James Forman teaches constitutional law in a course called Race, Class, and Punishment. Last year, he took his teaching behind prison walls, offering a seminar called Inside Out Prison Exchange, Issues in Criminal Justice, which brought together 10 Yale law students and 10 men incarcerated in a Connecticut prison. Professor Forman has written many law review articles, in addition to op-eds and essays for many national publications. And of course, his first book is the critically acclaimed Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America, which was awarded the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction. One other thing about James that many of you already know is that he is the son of one of the most important leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. James Forman was executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during its most active days. And his mother was also heavily involved with SNCC and served as coordinator of SNCC's Atlanta chapter. James has picked up the torch from his parents and the other brave men and women from that era, and is now one of the most important voices in a new civil rights movement that focuses on ending mass incarceration and creating more fairness in our criminal justice system. The New York Avenue Presbyterian Church's McClendon Scholar Program is pleased to welcome James Forman Jr.
Thank you very much for this honor. I'm very sad not to be with you in person, but I am honored to be with you remotely. I was originally scheduled to give this talk in person back in April, and a lot has happened since then. COVID, of course, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others whose memories we honor and whose deaths we mourn. And they've sparked a movement, a reckoning. You know, I don't know what it was like to be alive. You know, Theo talked about my parents. I don't know what it was like to be alive in 1960 when Black students from North Carolina A&T sat in a segregated Woolworths counter and refused to leave until they were served. I don't know what it was like to be alive in 1963 when 250,000 people went to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I don't know what it was like to be in Selma in 1965 when many members of SNCC and led by John Lewis, who we honor in his recent passing, when they faced racist sheriffs and billy clubs marching for the right to vote. I don't know what it was like to feel that moment, but it might have felt something like it feels now. It might have felt like a moment when resistance was possible and when change was in the air. So over the next two sessions, tonight and next Thursday, we're going to talk about charting a path forward to building a less racist world and a fairer criminal system. But I thought we should start tonight, the beginning of that conversation, spending a few minutes talking about where we've been and how we got here. So I want to share a little bit of the history of Washington, D.C., and I do that with the hope that seeing some of the mistakes and the missteps of the past might help us avoid making similar ones going forward. So if you bear with me, I just want to take us back for a moment to 25 years ago, 1994, Superior Court, Washington, D.C., where I was a public defender. And I was representing a young man by the name of Brandon. Brandon was a juvenile client, 16 years old. He had been charged with possession of a gun and a small amount of marijuana. And I was his lawyer, trying to get him out. And I had taken the job of being a public defender because I viewed it then, and as I view it now, as the civil rights work of my generation. My parents, as you heard, met in SNCC. And their generation transformed this nation. They made it possible for me to have opportunities that were unimaginable to a Black man of my father's generation and of previous generations. And yet and still, with all the change that they had achieved, as I was graduating law school, looking for work in the 1990s, I could see that there was one place where things had not improved, where they had, if anything, gotten worse, and that was our criminal system. You know, when I was graduating from law school, we didn't even have the term mass incarceration, but we already knew from the work of the Sentencing Project, one of the organizations who was going to be lifted up in conversation this evening. We already knew from the Sentencing Project's report that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision, that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa in the late 1980s to earn the dishonor of being the world's largest jailer. And so I wanted to fight that fight. I wanted to fight that struggle. And that brought me to Superior Court, Washington, D.C. It brought me to be standing next to Brandon, asking for his release. I wanted him to go home. It was his first arrest. His mother and grandmother were there in court. They wanted him home. The prosecutor in the case, she wanted him to go to Oak Hill, which for those of you on the call from DC, you'll remember Oak Hill. You're of a certain vintage. If you don't remember Oak Hill, that probably means you're a little bit younger. But you know it was a terrible place. It was a place where young people always left off worse than when they entered. The judge had to make the decision in the case. Judge Curtis Walker, I changed his name from what happened in real life. This is a real case, but I changed his name to protect the identity of everybody involved in this hearing, especially of Brandon. Judge Walker looks out in the courtroom, and what does he see? He sees a young black man facing sentencing. He sees an African-American defense attorney. He sees a black prosecutor. The judge himself happened to be African-American. And he looks at Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, son, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation. The judge proceeded to lecture Brandon on what that was like. And he said, so here's the thing, son. People marched, people fought, people died for your freedom. And they didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on, embarrassing your family, embarrassing your community, carrying those drugs and carrying that gun. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope one day you turn it around. But today in this courtroom, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. They locked him up. And I was so angry, so frustrated, so furious. I mean, the judge, think about it. He had just taken the same history, right, that motivated me to become a public defender. The same decades, the same heroes. He had invoked Martin Luther King, no less. And he had used that as a twisted rationale for why it made sense to lock up another young black man. And as angry as I was, and in many ways, as y'all can probably still tell in my voice, I still haven't gotten over it. But as angry as I was at the judge, you know, when I left that courtroom and I started talking to the other public defenders in my office, I continued a conversation that we had had many a time, which was that, you know, we lived in a majority black city with a majority black police force and a black mayor and a black police chief. The chief prosecutor in the city at that time was none other than Eric Holder. And yet, and still, even with that African-American representation in our system, we were making the same choices. We were doing the same things. We had the same stop and frisk policies, the same mandatory minimums, and it was producing the same results. The Sentencing Project had said that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. Well, in DC at the time, it was 1 in 2. And so I really began to wrestle with that question of what is deeper, what is going on? What was so powerful, so all-consuming, so ever present, that even in this majority black jurisdiction, we would still be creating and sustaining and maintaining mass incarceration. And that's the research project that I've been involved with for many years. It's produced the book that Theo referenced. And so let me just give you a couple, I'm not going to spend too much time, but let me just give you a couple of the main points to understand a little bit about how we got here, because I think it is crucial. It is crucial. And as you listen to these themes, I want you to think about the conversation right now, because a lot of the things that help to produce the system that we have are things that you will still hear today in conversation as justifications, as rationales for mass incarceration. And the first thing that we have to grapple with and we have to understand is rising crime and violence and the fear and the anger that they generated, especially in Black communities, and especially in 2 decades, the 1980s and the early 1990s, which some of y'all remember, the crack years in this country. And then what not as many people remember, but the 1960s, when heroin did to Black communities in this country what crack would do 2 decades later. The homicide rate in this country doubled in the 1960s. It tripled in Washington, D.C. And heroin really took over. They tested people every year going into the DC jail to see if they were addicts. And in 1963, they found that 4% were addicts. By the end of the 1960s, by 1969, the 4% had become 45%, right? That's an epidemic. And it wasn't just the numbers, right? But it was also the response that it produced in the community. In doing my research, I found letters from city council members. There were a number of them that, fortunately for me as a researcher, kept every letter that they received. And what you see in the 60s and the 70s, these are majority Black citizens. DC was 70% Black at the time, writing to a majority Black city council. 11 out of 13 members of the initial city council in 1975 in DC were Black. And what you see in these letters is a real pain and an anguish. People are saying, we just fought the civil rights movement and yet I'm scared to leave my house. They say there's addicts everywhere. They say there's guns everywhere. There's violence everywhere. I'm afraid to even let my kid walk to school alone because of the violence. And at the end of these letters, they always end with some version of do something about it. Do something, you gotta do something about it. Now, who was receiving these letters? This was, in many cities in this country, and in Washington, D.C. in particular, the people receiving these letters were the first generation of Black elected officials to be elected into office in any number in this country. In the 1970s, we had an 800% increase in Black elected officials in this country. Now, it was 800% increase from almost zero, but it was an 800% increase nonetheless, and it was because of the Voting Rights Act. And this generation, many of them were in the civil rights movement. A lot of them were from the South, grew up in the South, families had moved from the South. A lot of them knew the history of the underprotection of the law in Black communities. They remember, my dad used to tell me about this. My dad's from the South side of Chicago and from Mississippi, back and forth. And he used to talk about Chicago. He said, we didn't call the police in our neighborhood under Jim Crow when there was a problem because the police weren't gonna come. And if they did, the only thing we could be sure of is they were gonna make matters worse. This generation, they remember Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. Asked about a homicide in a Black neighborhood, they said, oh, that's not a homicide, that's another dead Black person. And they did not use the words Black person. So this generation was formed and shaped by that history. And when they came into office, when they came into power, with the power that they had, limited as it was, they wanted to use it to try to make law enforcement responsive to those Black citizens who had been begging for protection for decades and had never received it. So, okay, crime is rising, right? People are scared, they're asking for protection, and there's a generation of elected officials that wants to provide it. But why police and why prisons and why prosecutors? Why is that the response that communities got? And here's where you get to a really crucial part of my story, because what I'm really interested in, what I've always been interested in, is African-American political actors. I'm interested in Black politics and Black politicians and Black intellectuals, right? That's my passion. And that's what I try to put on the page in my book. But any account, any historical account that is focused on Black actors, African-American actors, also has to be about the constraints and the limitations that they were under, and in many ways still are to this day under. So let me just mention a couple of those. The first constraint, right, that Black politicians have always faced in this country is a historical one. Black politicians have been elected to represent communities that, because of a history of racism, because of a history of redlining, a history of racism that goes back to slavery. We're finally having this conversation. But the thing people don't remember, or never really say that much about slavery, is that we had slavery in this country for longer than we have it. It gets presented as a little period of American history. And my son's just finished 5th grade, and it's one unit. It's like a month out of the school year. And I get it. I mean, I don't want him to study slavery all year long either. But the way they present it can hide the fact that, as I said, we had slavery from 1619 to 1865, which is more years than from 1865 to the present. And of course, what followed behind slavery was a period of racial oppression. So that from 1619 till the 1960s, I'm not talking about in fact or de facto racial oppression. I'm talking about in law. It was the organizing principle of law written in the code to segregate and exclude and discriminate against Black people. And what that meant is that Black communities were denied the opportunity to build wealth. So I don't know if in the chat, I don't know if anybody is from Atlanta, where I'm from, but when we think about how wealth got destroyed in Black communities, it was very specific and it was very concrete. So in Atlanta, for example, if you've driven through the city, I know there's at least one person on this call who's from Atlanta because I saw her in the chat, my old friend Serena Nunn. But if you drive through Atlanta, what you will be driving through in the middle of the city, when you're on I-75 or I-85, you're driving through what was once called back then the Black Wall Street. Y'all heard about in Tulsa, right? The Black Wall Street. Well, there was more than one Black Wall Street throughout the country. And there was one in Atlanta, Auburn Avenue, a thriving Black community that was decimated when the federal highway was run right through it. Well, why was it put there? Because that was the community that had the least political clout, that couldn't resist it. So Black elected officials have been elected to represent communities that, because of this history of racial subordination, lack the resources often that they need to protect themselves. And so they're over-reliant on police, they're over-reliant on prosecutors. The other constraint that we need to talk about is a political constraint. African-American political power in this country has always been, to the extent there has been any, it's been local. It's been local elected officials, city council members, mayors. And local politics is important. In fact, we're going to be talking on this later in this talk and in our next talk about local politics and how important it's going to be to resisting mass incarceration. But there are also limits to what local government can do, and you see that in American history. So Black elected officials, right, for the last 50 years have had what I like to call an all of the above strategy to fighting crime and violence. They've said, we want more police and more prosecutors, and sometimes, unfortunately, they even said in the 90s, we want more prisons. But they also said, we want more money for job training. We want more money for schools, for mental health programs, for addiction services, right? We want more money for after-school programs. For 50 years, Black elected officials have been going to the federal government, to Congress, and asking for money for all of the above. And for 50 years, they've been coming back with money for what? One of the above: law enforcement, police, prosecutors, and prisons. And the last constraint that I want to mention that explains some of how we got here and some of the choices that Black politicians have made. The last constraint is a constraint of imagination. So what do I mean by this? Let me give you an example from Washington, D.C. One of the people that I write about is a city council member named David Clark. Now, if you've been in D.C. for any period of time, you may remember David Clark. He was, I told y'all that 11 out of 13 people on that first city council were African-American. David Clark was one of the 2 white members of the initial city council. And he was not a drug warrior. In fact, for our purposes, what you should know is that he fought for marijuana decriminalization back in 1975. He was way ahead of his time. So now it's the early 1980s, and Dave Clark is the chair of the city council, and heroin has come back in the city. And he's deluged with letters from citizens talking about this heroin problem. And they're talking about addicts nodding off on benches, addicts sleeping in parks, dirty syringes found in alleys, right? Now, David Clark gets all of these letters, and what does he do with them? he sends them to the head of the relevant government agency and he says, listen, I've got all these complaints. And the head of that agency writes him back and says, we're on the case, Chairman Clark, we're going to take care of it. Now, who does David Clark send these letters to? Remember, he's not a drug warrior. And remember, the problem is addicts in public space. So does he send the letters to the Department of Mental Health, Addiction Services, Drug Treatment? No. He sends them to the police chief. Why? Because his imagination is constrained. And like so many Americans, he's not able to think of the problem of addicts in public space as a problem that we would send a social worker, a counselor, addiction services specialist to. He thinks of it as a problem that we should send a police officer to. And one of my arguments in my book and in my research is that to understand how we got this system of mass incarceration, yes, it's important to look at statements of presidents and acts of Congress, right? And there's certain villains in our history, there's no question about it, right? There's people that actively fought for, right, entrenching this system. But there's also a lot of these smaller decisions made at the local level, and some of them made by people with good intentions. And those small decisions, like this decision about which agency to reach out to when you get a citizen complaint about addicts in public space, addicts in a park, which agency do you reach out to? That those small decisions made across every city, across every county, across every state, across 50 years, those individual small decisions are the building blocks that collectively built the system of mass incarceration that we live with today. All right, so that's a little bit about how we got here. And so what do we do now? Well, I'm going to talk with Reverend Daniels later in this webinar in just a few minutes and next week. And we're going to talk about some concrete steps and some particular organizations that are doing really path-breaking work that we want to encourage you to sign up with. But in the last little bit here of my opening remarks, I just want to offer some guiding principles that I think grow out of the history that I just presented to you. And the first one is this: we have to be relentless in our commitment to pursue solutions outside of the criminal system. The story of the last 50 years is how we've turned to the criminal system over and over again to solve problems that should have been solved elsewhere. This is the point of the David Clark story. And it's not just that example, but it's over and over again. What are the largest mental health facilities that we have in this country? Well, the largest 3 mental health facilities that we have right now in this country are Rikers Island, the Cook County Jail, and the LA County Jail. And the criminal system is happy to grab as many resources as it can get. So the ACLU of Massachusetts, and I think we're going to be able to share a link to this report in the chat. I hope you don't go read it now, because I hope you stay focused on the webinar, but later on, I hope you get a chance to look at it. And I hope you try to think about doing a report like this in your community. But they issued a stunning report this summer called Unpacking the Boston Police Budget. And it revealed that the city's police department, get this, has almost 3 times as much money as is devoted to health and human services, 4 times as much money as goes to public health in a pandemic, 10 times larger than the library system, 15 times larger than the neighborhood development department, and 25 times larger than what goes to parks and recreation. So, people, there's that saying, don't tell me your values, right? Show me your budget, and then I'll know your values. And this is the point. The criminal system will keep taking any amount of funding that it can get. And it will make the argument that, well, if you want to do this thing, let's give the money to the police so that they can handle it and they can do it. And that's the thing that we absolutely have to resist. Now, as we work to shrink these police budgets, we're going to have to work just as hard, I would say, maybe even harder, to build up the alternatives. we're going to have to replace this system with community-based and government-based alternative structures that do the things that vulnerable communities need most and need instead of police, prosecutors, or courts. And this is going to be hard, y'all, because we've spent 50 years in this country, minimum. You could argue even more, but at a minimum, the mass incarceration era, 50 years of building police, of building prisons, of building courts, right? Of building up prosecutors' offices. We know how to do that. But we, the collective us, right? The people that are on this webinar and throughout the city and this country, we're going to be the ones to have to build the restorative justice programs. We're going to be the ones to have to build the diversion programs, the tutoring, the mentoring programs, the mental health programs, the drug treatment programs. And we're going to have to fund them year in and year out. And we're going to have to not let them be the first to have their budget cut when the city hits tough times. You know, we're going to have to move, and some of this is going to have to be individual work for each and every person on this webinar. We're going to have to move beyond the not in my backyard mentality, right? That says, oh yes, I support people struggling with addiction. I want services for those people, but don't put that treatment center in my neighborhood. Don't put the affordable housing in my neighborhood. Don't put the homeless shelter in my neighborhood. Right? We're going to have to resist the mentality that says, well, I oppose mass incarceration. I want alternatives to locking people up. But then the first time a crime is committed by somebody who had been locked up, and the local story, the local newspaper in your community runs a story that's funneled to them by the local prosecutor, and we all turn around and say, oh, well, I didn't mean let that guy out. He should have been locked up. She should have been locked up. That's the mentality that we're going to have to resist. Now, this, let me just say to y'all, I've said this before, but I just want to say it one more time. This is not going to be easy. And this work is not going to be popular. It is not going to make us popular. But fighting for justice is never popular. And I learned that from my dad, and I just want to leave you with a story. Theo invoked him in the opening, and I just want to leave you with a story that my dad, about a conversation I had with my dad. And it was, saw y'all a couple in the chat were in Adams Morgan. So this conversation took place in Adams Morgan, in Harvard Hall, small apartment that he lived in. And we had just finished watching a movie about the civil rights movement. And when the movie went off, I asked my dad, what'd you think about it? You were there. And he said that he liked it. He said, I was really glad they put this on film because, more people watch movies than read books, which I can assure y'all, as now that I'm an author, I can assure y'all that is true. And he said, but the thing that I didn't like about the movie is that they made it seem like everybody was in the movement. They made it seem like it was popular. And he said that wasn't true. We were unpopular. He talked about how the March on Washington, and I since did research and I found out what he's saying is exactly true. The March on Washington, the famous March on Washington, was not popular when it happened. It had a two-thirds of the people said they thought the March on Washington would hurt the cause of the Negro. Martin Luther King was not popular when he died. 60% of people had an unfavorable view of Martin Luther King when he died. And now Dr. King speaking at the March on Washington is what they show on continuous loop in Black History Month, as if he was a hero during his lifetime. And my dad said, listen, the reason I'm telling you this story, the reason why I want you to know how hard it was, my dad talked about being run off college campuses when he was trying to recruit people to join SNCC. He said, the reason I'm telling you this is not because I want credit for being there first. He said, the reason I'm telling you this is because the way they present this history, it's demoralizing to your generation and it's demoralizing to the generations behind you. Because, and I know there's people on this call who are going to understand this, but you call a meeting and there's 6 or 7 people who come to the meeting and 5 of them were at the last meeting. And it makes you wonder, well, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my cause? Everybody was marching in Selma. Everybody was marching in Birmingham, Montgomery, Albany. But no, they weren't. You know, my dad said that even the March on Washington, right? 250,000 people, that's an enormous number. But a decade later, 10 million people would say they were there. So this was my dad's point. My dad's point was that in the moment, in the time, people are always going to tell you that change is impossible. And if you ignore them and you march and you organize and you mobilize and you get together in community and churches and otherwise, and you create the change that they told you was impossible, they're all going to turn around the next day and say, oh yeah, that was inevitable. I knew that was going to happen. And then they'll make a movie about it. So I don't know what our movie is going to be, but I'm confident that there's somebody here on this webinar that's going to have an idea tonight and next Thursday that is more powerful than anything I've even imagined. And one day you are going to take down mass incarceration. And when you do that, and when they make the movie about you, I will be there in the front row applauding and cheering you on. So thank you. Thank you for joining this conversation, and I look forward to more with Reverend Daniels.
Thank you so much, James, for those helpful and inspiring remarks. We look forward to the second half now of this webinar, where we're going to interact with you and also discuss some of the things that you've pointed to and specific things that are happening in Washington, D.C. and other communities. As we get ready to do that, I just want to invite each of you to pause for a moment, reflect on what you've heard from James Forman Jr., and sort of prepare yourself for the rest of the program. There are two questions I suggest you think about. First of all, what information or comments did you just hear that resonated the most with you? What sticks out in your mind about what he just said? Secondly, what thoughts have you had tonight or recently as you've been in protests or thought about these issues, about how you might do more than you're doing now to create more justice and fairness in our policing, in our courts, and in our prisons? So I suggest you keep these thoughts in mind as we go forward into the discussion. And we'll also be at the very end inviting some of you to share some of your ideas. When we open up chat at the end, we want to record some of your thoughts and look at them after the webinar. So before we go into conversation with James, I want to take just 2 or 3 minutes and share some information about 4 organizations that are involved in good work on some of the issues that we're talking about this evening. We also will be sharing some information a little later on about some additional groups. And then next week, we'll be sharing even more. We want you to be aware of good efforts that are already underway. So you see here some information about 2 groups. First is the Council for Court Excellence. They're DC based and they focus on creating a justice system in the district that equitably serves everyone. They identify and propose solutions by collaborating with diverse stakeholders to do research, advance policy, educate the public, and increase civic engagement. They use volunteers in several ways on their projects, and they also invite their more active volunteers to get involved in governance of the organization. You see their website there, and then particularly the Get Involved link to learn more about the council. By the way, I want you to know not only are we sharing in chat information about these groups, but we're going to send an email tomorrow to everyone who registered for this webinar with this information. So you'll be able to revisit it if you're not able to get all of the links at this point. Secondly is the Justice Policy Institute. If we could go back to that one still, so people can see that link. The Justice Policy Institute, we're on the next slide here, but there it is. Justice Policy Institute is a national nonprofit that works to change the conversation around justice reform and work for well-being and justice for all communities. You see their website there, and they do use folks, and they need volunteers to help with advocacy they do in the District of Columbia. And in fact, they wanted us to announce that they have a webinar of their own they're doing next Wednesday night, the 2nd, that they're co-sponsoring with the Attorney General's office in DC. And I mention it because for those of you particularly interested in immediate issues in Washington, DC, that webinar would be a good way to get that. The next organization then is the Sentencing Project. James mentioned it earlier. They're one of the really well-known groups for 34 years. They've been doing research and working in various ways to address unjust racial disparities and practices. And their website is filled with good information about mass incarceration and different things people are doing about it. And I really urge you to look at that website just to educate yourself. And you also may want to look for ways to be involved with them. And fourth is a group called Equal Justice Under Law. It's a nonprofit law organization, and they use the strategy of class action impact litigation. They try to set legal precedent and change cultural norms so that poor and rich get treated equally. There are a lot of areas in terms of bail, in terms of suspension of driver's licenses, in terms of debtors' prisons that still exist in many ways, where they have developed an expertise in fighting these practices to try to change them. And their website tells some ways that you can be involved in. Of course, they need donors to support their work. So I commend that webpage to you also if you want to learn about how you can be involved with them. All right, we'll be sharing some other groups at the end of the evening. Remember that the Q&A function is open. Several questions have already been asked. You can like a question. You can write out one of your own. And after this next conversation between Reverend Daniels and James Forman Jr., we'll go to some of the questions you've been asking. So I now invite Reverend Daniels to make some brief comments and then engage in a discussion with James in any way he wishes to do so.
Thank you, Theo. It's great to be a part of this great gathering. And thank you, Theo. It's great to be a part of this gathering and great to be with everyone this evening. Great to be with Professor Forman. Thank you, James, for just a tremendous presentation. This has my mind racing on a number of fronts. My father was a former federal agent back in the 50s who was experienced both sides. He experienced the chasing after criminals, and then he himself experienced police brutality himself, even as a former agent. So my mind is racing on a lot of these things. Also, my mind is racing on all the different things that as a pastor, as a part of a congregation here locally, we can do. Some we're seeking to do, some we need to do more of. And so I really appreciate all that you've laid out. I want to ask you from the start, would you summarize for us some of the specific changes that you believe we ought to be working on with regards to policing and courts and prisons, just so that we can have them in our frame as we move through our discussion this evening? Could you summarize that?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. It's an important question, but it is a challenging question, and here's why. In building up this system, this punitive system that we have developed over the last 50 years, it touches in every nook and cranny of American society, right? So we haven't even begun to have a conversation, for example, about employers and the role that employers play in making it hard for people to get back on their feet by refusing to hire people that have a criminal record, right? We haven't even talked about housing and real estate and how it can be hard to get an apartment if you have a criminal record. So I guess what I want to say is, I don't know that I'd be able to give like, here's the three most important things, because there are so many things. So really the way I like to turn it around to people is, and say is, well, what is the domain that you can control? Like,
Mhm.
what's your sphere of influence, right? Are you, again, just to talk about employer, do you work in a company? Well, what are your HR policies, right? The Ford Foundation recently scrubbed their HR policies from top to bottom, and they found they had all kinds of exclusions, making it impossible for you to get hired if you had a criminal record, but they took most of them out. And they went even further and they said, well, we are going to actually affirmatively do outreach to try to hire people who have a criminal record. And so if you want to become a second chance employer, for example, just Google the term second chance employer. You can go to my website, jamesformanjr.com. I have a link to employment where it talks about how you can become a second chance employer. So I guess what I want to say is it's so hard to identify, you know, here's like the three most important things. But I would say this about policing. The three most important categories are reducing the size of the police budget, because right now police do a lot of functions that they are not best equipped to do. Take that money and move it into organizations and agencies. I've talked about mental health. I've talked about addiction services, right? I've talked about counseling and social work. Move it into those places. And number three is real accountability for those officers who break the law, who violate the law, who abuse citizens' rights, right? So those to me are the three things: reduce the police budget, move that money to other places, and then real accountability. Now, even the term real accountability is a little vaguer than I would want as a lawyer, because, well, what does that mean? Well, the answer is going to look different in different parts of the country. But in some places, it's going to mean looking at your police union contract, right? And as citizens, actually going down to the city council and saying, we want to see copies of the police union contract, or we have copies of the police union contract because they've been put online. And there's an organization called Campaign Zero, which is putting a lot of these contracts online. And asking the basic question, well, what are the policies and the procedures for when there is a complaint, right? Who's the person that actually is the decision maker? Is it the police chief who's actually the decision maker? How much influence does the union have over that process? So, like I said, it's a harder to me question than one that I could just give you sort of like 3 bullet points on,
Gotcha.
But that's what I would focus on.
So let me ask your feelings about when you were observing the protests, participating in the protests after the George Floyd murder, particularly here in the district, and the painting of Black Lives Matter on the street, and then the painting of defund the police. You've talked about the multiple dimensions, of course, that we need to do. It's hard to really focus on one. But if you were to advise groups that are doing advocacy, like New York Avenue is, my congregation, Emory is, Metropolitan AME is, and others in the city as a part of the Washington Interfaith Network, what specific advice would you offer advocacy groups in terms of the angles in which to reduce police budget, particularly in DC, which has the largest number of police of any city in the country? What would be your angle?
Well, the first thing I think you would have to do is have some exposure. So I made reference to that ACLU report earlier. I have not seen a report that is that comprehensive done in most cities. I haven't seen one done like that for DC. I mean, that report, for example, reveals, and I'm not saying this would be true in DC, but there are either 300 or 400, I don't have the report in front of me, employees of the Boston Police Department who make more than the mayor. Okay, so let me just say that again.
Yeah.
300 to 400 officers who make more than the mayor. Well, why is that? It's because of some of the structure of their contracts and the over-reliance on overtime, right? And there's lots of little, like they have in their collective bargaining agreement, for example, that if you get called to court, you get 4 hours of minimum, no matter how much time you spend in court. So you go down to court, spend half an hour, you get 4 hours pay. So that's just one example. So the first thing is exposing and revealing the problem. And so I would encourage local organizations to look at that report in particular, just because it's one of the best ones I've ever seen done, and say, all right, let's do the DC version of this. And the next thing to do is to be very concrete and very specific about, here's where we want the money to go instead. And in my opinion, anyway, and there are advocates who will disagree with me about this, and I respect the differences of opinion. But my view would be, when you're making the argument about what should be done with the money instead, you always are going to want to tie it back to public safety concerns. So you're going to want to explain to people, all right, we're going to take this amount of money and we're going to use it to support the following mental health treatment programs or addiction services programs, right? That we don't have now.
Right.
And you explain to people, because in my opinion, in Black communities in particular, Reverend Daniels, and I'm sure your congregation will understand this, the kind of libertarian argument of like, well, you know, we don't need any, just keep the government out of our lives entirely. That doesn't really fly, because because crime is real, and addiction is real, and homelessness is real, and people are scared, right? And that fear is part of what drove what we got. So I think we have to be very real about people's fear and explain to them concretely how the things we're going to do with this money are actually going to make them safer. Because if you tell people less police, we're going to reduce police or reduce prisons, but you don't tell them what you're going to do instead, at least in the Black community, that's not going to work. It's just not.
Right. As we're dialoguing, I want to hear from you. What does the movie look like for you?
Oh man, Reverend, it was hard enough for me to write a book. Now you want me to do a movie too.
So for us,
I don't know, but I know for sure that it has this in it. It has older people telling younger people that this idea that they have cannot be done. And it has younger people ignoring them. And it has younger people being right.
Huh. Say more.
Well, I guess what I mean is, like, if you look at the civil rights movement itself, right? And again, let's just talk about John Lewis, since he just passed.
Right.
But John Lewis was the chairperson of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the organization that both my parents worked in.
Right.
And when SNCC was founded as a response to that sit-in movement in the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and all around the South in the 1960s. And at the end of all of these sit-ins that had taken place, there was conversation about how, well, we have to create an organization, right? We have to come together to try to make this thing have some structure and some legs so that it can last beyond this moment. And the initial proposal, the pastors, including SCLC, Dr. King's organization, the pastors said and the pastors were, Dr. King was young, but the pastors were mostly older.
Right.
And they said, well, you all should become the youth division of the SCLC, the youth division of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Ella Baker, one of the great unsung heroes of the movement.
Yes.
Ella Baker said to the students, and Ella Baker was in SCLC. She said to the students, don't do that. Don't become the youth arm of the ministers, because if you become the youth arm of the ministers, they're gonna run your movement, and you need to be independent, because as young people, you're gonna be more radical than you're gonna, by definition, be more radical than the middle-aged folks. And so John Lewis and the rest of those students did that, and they created SNCC. And I don't think we would have had the civil rights movement that we have today, but for the fact of the youthful energy of students and SNCC who were willing to kind of do things that some of that older generation was uncomfortable with. And so that's an example of what I mean.
I love that. I love that. I want to play out this movie motif a little more because that was powerful. You're talking about the movie.
Okay.
Transfer that now to what would you say to current Black politicians? I thought you were brilliant in laying out the history of what that first elected class of Black politicians had to face. In light of what you just said about not listening to, per se, the older generation, what would you say to the Black mayors around the country? Obviously, many of our cities, Atlanta, where you're from, here in DC, Chicago, we know many cities have Black mayors now. What would you say to them from a political persuasion, what you just said about the younger generation in the movement?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I have to be honest, it's a hard question. And I don't want to underestimate how hard their job is. I really don't, because again, in doing this research and writing this book, I really became educated about the intense pressures that they were under. But I guess the first thing I guess I would say is that a number of that previous generation that endorsed some of these quote unquote tough on crime, and I don't even like to use that term because I don't even think it's actually tough, suggested it's effective, and I don't think it's effective,
Right.
but some of those harsh measures
Right.
have since come to me privately and say, I read your book and I appreciate how you were fair to us in the sense that you did show the pressure that we were under, but you were also hard on us because you ultimately said we were wrong. And I agree, we were wrong. Now, they're not going to say that, politicians don't say that publicly, not going to happen.
Right.
And nobody has authorized me to share their name. But
Right.
more than a few have said that to me, and that they have a lot of regrets. And so I guess really I would say, listen to young people. It doesn't mean and when I say listen to, obviously, I work with students myself, like every idea that comes in the door, I don't do. But you have to be open. And when you hear, I guess this is the thing, when you hear something over and over again and it's consistent, then try to ask yourself, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. And so that's one thing. And I guess also really lift up the voices of people that have been most directly affected by the system, people who have been arrested, who have been incarcerated. That's happening more now than it was in the 90s, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's still not happening enough. It's still too rare that, we have those, it's too infrequent that we have those voices in conversations like this one, frankly.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. Let's open up our conversation to Q&As that many people on the line have. And so if we could just open up, Theo, if you could lead us through some question and answer times, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Joe. We just want to keep the discussion going and bring in some of the folks who've been sending in questions. There's several questions, and you've talked about a little already, but there are enough questions about this whole thing about defunding and what it actually looks like. One person points out that it's public money from local, county, state. How do you deal with that or distribute those things? And then is defunding enough, or what other fundamental reforms are required? So what would you add about the defunding and any ways to help us think about that more clearly?
Well, I guess I mean, I don't want to suggest that it's easy to execute on, because it's not, because there are obstacles to moving money around in budgets. And we've talked a little bit about collective bargaining agreements, right? That there's guarantees that have been made. There's pension guarantees that have been made to public employees, and you can't just override all of that, right? So this is not simple in its execution. I don't want to suggest that it is, but it is conceptually, I think, fairly straightforward. I have a friend that used to work in DC government, in the mayor's office and in other offices, and this story that I'm about to tell you is not a DC specific. You can find a version of this story in city after city. But he talked about how he worked in the mayor's office or city council. At the beginning of the budget cycle, there would always be some proposal to reduce or freeze, typically to reduce the police budget. And they would say, it's grown this much and this much and this much, and we just have to cut back. And people would come and testify, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he never really understood how or why, but at the end of the cycle, when it all had worked through and you were now at the last markup and the last bill, whatever the original number was of what the police got last year, it was that much and maybe a little bit more. And his view was that elected officials were fundamentally scared to reduce that number, because the moment they reduce that number and then there's any crime that takes place, they can immediately be blamed for the rise in crime. And that's why I said in my opening remarks that we have to gird ourselves. We can't be driven by the one incident. We can't be driven by a 2-week spike, right? A 2-week increase. This is what drives media, and it scares politicians. But we have to gird ourselves against that. So I guess I would say conceptually, I actually think it's fairly straightforward. And then Theo, it looked like you were about to jump in with a follow-up.
No, just there are several about this, and the one person, just maybe a quick thought on it. They said they like the idea and understand the concept, but they're a little afraid of the slogan, defund the police. That turns some people's off. And what's your thoughts on that? Is there another way of saying it, or is that the right term, you think, the best term?
So, I mean, I'm not a political, I'm a law professor, right? And a public defender, and I don't advise politicians in that way. I do think the language that you use is going to matter a lot based on the jurisdiction that you're in, the office that you're running for. I think it's obviously, just to take an extreme example, if you're running for president, then that's going to be you have a different voting base that you have to worry about than if you're running for a city council member in a particular ward that may have a more kind of decidedly progressive bent. So I want to be clear about that. But I get the point about the concern about the term defund. I really do. And it's not my favorite term for the reason that came up in my conversation with Reverend Daniels, which is that, to me, I want to talk about what we're building instead. And of course, people that are part of the defund movement, and for the abolition movement for that matter, talk all the time about what they want to build instead. They're the first ones talking about it, but the term doesn't capture it, right? The term focuses people's attention on what you're taking away and not what you're putting in place instead. And so I don't have the term that we should use, and other terms like reimagine, which I do like, has become a little bit watered down, and people that don't want to change very much say, well, let's reimagine. Right. So I don't know what the right new term is, but I have a lot of belief in the concept of reallocating some of this money.
There's a question about the incarceration of particularly of youthful defenders and this practice of giving long prison sentences to juveniles even. And I understand there's some efforts underway in DC and other locations to try to rethink some of that. So people who have been sentenced to these long sentences and they're underage at the time. Could you say a bit more about that and the ideas how we ought to handle that issue as a society, and how we can go back and review maybe some of these terrible sentences that were handed out?
Yeah, absolutely. And DC, one of the really remarkable things, and advocates who are on this call and who are part of this webinar really deserve credit for this, because DC, the politics in Washington, DC on the issues that I'm talking about have changed a lot in recent years. And this is one of the areas, and I hope perhaps somebody can put in the chat a link to maybe a newspaper article about the legislation. But DC, over the last 2 or 3 years, has passed a series of pieces of legislation that what they allow judges to do is they allow somebody who was sentenced to a very long sentence as a young person, right? Either juvenile or now it's been extended to young adult. They allow them, after they have served a certain period of time, to petition for resentencing, to go back to the judge and say, look, here's what I've done with my life in this period of time that I've been incarcerated. They're able to bring evidence about adolescent brain development that was not available in the 1990s when the initial judge made the sentencing decision, right? They're able to put that forward. Sometimes in the intervening years, advocates have been able to reach out to the family of the victim of the crime, right? Who may now be in a position where they feel like, you know what, this person has served 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, however many it is. Them being further locked up is not helping me. It is not helping me heal. And so in that period of time, right, judges are now then able to make a new decision. And there have been, I think Mark Schindler may be on this call, but the Justice Policy Institute has been really one of the organizations you lifted up, has done a lot of work in this. And again, not just helping those people be resentenced, but also supporting them when they come back to the community. I hope when people are thinking, and we're going to talk about this, I know, next Thursday, but this is one of the huge challenges, right? Is, okay, you got locked up when you were 17, 18, 19. You were in for 15, 20 years. Now you're back. Well, that's a hard transition. That's a very hard transition, especially considering the fact that it's not like the first 16, 17, 18 years of that person's life were probably especially rewarding, right? So they got poorly educated, they suffered from trauma, they may have had addiction in their household, they get incarcerated. Now they're 38, 39. They're more mature, yes, but they need a lot of our collective community support. But I think those kinds of initiatives, and I really hope that anybody who's not in DC would look at that legislation as an example of something that they would try to push in their community. And one of the things that I especially love about it is it's not limited to, it's not even focused on people who had low-level offenses, right? In the Obama years, there was this idea that, well, we're going to do something for the quote unquote non-violent offenders or the drug offenders. But if you committed a violent crime, then you're off the table. We're not going to talk about you whatsoever. And what the second chance legislation in DC says is, no. Everybody is entitled to be looked at in the fullness of their humanity, including people that committed violent offenses when they were young. And breaking through that non-violent barrier, I think is one of the biggest challenges our movement faces. And I applaud that legislation for doing it.
We have time for one or two more questions here. And I do want to say, we're going to collect all these questions and we're going to look at them afterwards. And the ones we don't get to, we're going to take a little time at the beginning of our second webinar on September 3rd to pick up on some of these themes. And then before we go into the new content that evening about folks who are currently and formerly incarcerated, there are a couple of questions, one from David Sobelson and some others, just picking up on some of the comments about drugs and the impact. And of course, you mentioned that and how the terrible impact this had in the 90s. There are changes in attitudes on this, as there have been a number of things. What would you say about drug laws today and what we ought to be paying attention to in terms of how they contribute to mass incarceration?
Well, I think that we have to really separate out two things. So my wife is a nurse practitioner, and most of her patient caseload is people who are addicted to drugs. And addiction is a terrible, terrible, terrible disease. It leads people to places that they do not want to go, they do not want to be. It harms families, and at scale, it can devastate, right? That is true. It is also true that the way we have chosen to fight the drug war, right, has, instead of helping that very real problem that I just described, made it much, much, much worse. And it has done so because, in the early 1980s, there was Charlie Rangel was the chair of a commission, a drug commission, a joint task force on drugs. And they were basically faced with the option of, should we put more money into treatment, or should we put more money into enforcement? And the Reagan administration decided to not just double, triple, quadruple down on enforcement. So you had all these officials talking about how they needed more money to provide and care for people who are addicted in their community. And what did the federal government do in response? It ignored those things, and it said, we're going to throw more police and more prosecutors and more prisons at the problem. And so it seems to me that the call right now is very clear. We need to decriminalize as many drugs as we can find the political capacity to do. And we need to make sure that people have real, on-demand, available to them, high-quality treatment programs. When I represented people in DC, I had one client I remember who was charged with distribution of heroin. We tried to get her into a drug treatment program through the court system. And just as we were about to, her case got dismissed because the police messed up the paperwork. So now she's out in the community. She's the same person that she was the day before. Now we call back to try to get her into a treatment program, and there's a 13-month waiting list because the preference and the privilege had gone to the people who were in the court system. And even for them, there was a waiting list. So there weren't enough beds for people in the court system. But if you were just a regular citizen who called up the DC government and said, I'm addicted and I want to get real, meaningful inpatient drug treatment, the response you got was, give us your name and come back in 13 months. And that's what we have to fix in the city and across the country. And the money that we're currently spending policing and prosecuting and incarcerating people for drug offenses is the first place I would go to find the money we need for the programs that I'm talking about.
We have time for just one more kind of quick answer. And then again, we'll pick up on some of these in the second webinar. But there's a couple of questions also about training for police. Is this fertile territory? One woman writes about, for example, the country of Norway. She says they have a very extensive program. There may be other examples around the world. Is this an important area to look at, how police are trained, or is this not helpful given other systemic problems with the way policing works?
I guess I would say it depends. So I'm not sure about the Norway example. I would want to learn a little bit more about what exactly that entails. What I can say is that, like a lot of people, I'm increasingly suspicious of the kind of police training that we institute in this country as a response to a problem. So in essence, what has happened is police have said, well, give us more training, right? And, liberals and, academics and, they like training, like, oh, school is good, more school is good. Yeah, okay, we'll give you training. And then somebody gets a contract to do the training. And look, I'm a professor, right? I'm all about training. But the problem that we have right now is we put this little bit of training into a system that is so either dysfunctional or brutal, because there are people say, well, it's not dysfunctional because it's functioning as it's intended. But regardless of what you want to say about the system, is it's not serving the needs of our most vulnerable citizens, and it's harming Black and brown communities and poor communities in particular. And loading a little bit of training onto that is not going to make a difference.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much. Wish we had time to go into some more of these. And again, we'll look at them, and we're going to start a week from Thursday when we gather again with some of these questions that are already out there. Want to thank you again, and take just a moment to share some information on some other groups. There are 3 others we wanted to quickly let you know about. And then again, we'll be sending this information to you. But the DC Justice Lab, it's a new project that aims to have an impact and help transform the criminal justice system in the district. And they promote what they call decarceration, compassion, and providing people with tools and resources they need to thrive. It's a mixture of community organizers, analysts, and I think some law students and lawyers are involved, and they need volunteers to help with every aspect of their work. So it's a new group doing some innovative things, and you see the contact here. And then you can either go to that website or send an email to Patrice at DC Justice Lab. The next is the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. Many of you know about the Washington Lawyers Committee. They've been on the front line of civil rights work for 50 years. And because the criminal justice system is a prime driver of inequity, they're very involved in issues around criminal justice advocacy and direct services. They also are the local affiliate of the Sentencing Project. Sentencing Project is national, and on their website, they have information on groups they work with around the country, and the Lawyers Committee happens to be the local affiliate for that. One thing they wanted us to mention is that they're working with the Compassionate Release Project, and there are a number of efforts to get people who are incarcerated, particularly been incarcerated a long time, released because of COVID, and they need lawyers to help do that. And so you could go to their website or their executive director, Jonathan Smith, and it's just jonathan.smith@washlaw.org. But they're looking for lawyers right now who can help them work with the compassionate release appeals. And finally, the Rethink Justice Coalition. It's comprised of individuals committed to rethinking, reshaping criminal justice in the district. It's a participant-driven organization. Individuals can be as active or not active as they want to be. There are monthly meetings. They're all by Zoom now, of course, and there's a mailing list. So if you're interested in being a part of this group, you can see their website and you can push contact us and be involved in that way. All right. As we get near the end of our time, I have a few final announcements. But first, we're going to open the chat function again, and I have questions for you. And I'd like you to take a moment, and again, we're going to tally all of this, look at it, and try to help us as we shape future programs. 2 questions, and comment in chat on one or both of them. What was particularly helpful or valuable for you that you heard tonight? Something new or new insight, or maybe something that's really struck you that it was an important thing you weren't aware of. Give us some of your comments on that in the chat function, just as brief or extensive as you want. Or secondly, what else do you still want to know about? What other things that come to mind that you really, if you could just, talk to James or others involved in this directly, what are some of the things you'd want to hear about or know about? So take some time, and I hope a lot of you will enter some brief comments about those 2 things in the chat. All right, as you enter your comments, I have just a few closing announcements. The second webinar with James Forman Jr. will be Thursday, September 3rd at 7 o'clock. And I want to remind you that everyone who signed up for this webinar is already registered for that one. You do not need to re-register if you are hearing what I'm saying or if you're with us tonight. We will be setting up a registration for September 3rd, but you don't need to sign up. It'll only be for people who missed registering for tonight and want to join the next one. So we'll pick up on some of these issues, and then a major focus of our effort will be what we can do to assist current and formerly incarcerated individuals. And on the 3rd of September, Reverend William Lamar of Metropolitan AME will be joining us to make comments and engage in a discussion with James. Final thing, I just want to point out that we do have the link there, and I think if we could share the link now to James's book, if you've not read it, you might want to really look at it. And I want to turn, if we can, just as we close, first to to Joe Daniels. Joe, if you have just a brief word or some final things you'd like to say to us as we close the evening.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks, James, for presentations tonight. It's great to be a part of this. I just want to encourage everyone on the webinar to get involved some way, somehow. I remember not long ago, before COVID hit, I asked the congregation I serve, I said, how many of you have been personally impacted by the issue of mass incarceration or police brutality? I said, if you have somebody who in your family who's locked up, or you've been impacted yourself in some way, somehow, please stand. 75% of the people in our congregation that Sunday stood up. And so this issue impacts us greatly. There are people there are people in your congregations who are crying out for the opportunity to serve in this and who want to link with others who are serving. I want to give a shout out to two people in our congregation, George Chochos, who works for the Vera Foundation. Before that, worked for the Georgetown Pivot Program, himself a living testimony of what can happen when people care. He went from jail to Yale, is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and doing powerful transformation. Reggie Williamson, who like James Forman talked about earlier, and James himself was a public defender. Reggie Williamson in our congregation is doing public defender work. Both of them are helping to organize prison and returning citizen ministry in our congregation and community. And so if this is a call that God has placed upon your life, get involved, meet people, ask people about their interest in it, and see where in your community and in your congregation there is building interest on a particular issue. As James said, there may be particular issues that our particular congregations or communities have skills to really deal with. In our community, for example, we're looking at workforce development. We're looking at beginning a ministry that begins to train returning citizens in culinary arts training so that they can get back into the workforce through the restaurant industry. We're looking at housing issues. We're looking at even pastoral care issues. And so I just want to encourage everybody who is on this webinar. This is a major problem. We can get involved in this. We can participate in advocacy through the Washington Interfaith Network, through Metro Industrial Areas Foundation, through other groups that are advocating, as we've heard tonight. Let us get involved and let us bring about change to this horrific way that people of color, Black and brown, are being treated in this country. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate your participation tonight and all the work you're doing in the community. And we are at time, and I want to just invite the transitional pastor at New York Avenue, Reverend Heather Shortledge, who welcomed you when we started an hour and a half ago, to offer a few words as we close.
What comes next? As the anger and the anxiety of unjust systems that continue to deny people life exist in our world, what comes next? We hope that tonight has helped inspire and move you toward answering that question for yourself, and that you will come back for the second part of this conversation on September 3rd. Between now and then, as you leave tonight, may those who are weary, find rest. And may those who carry great burdens find strength. May those suffering with addiction find care, not incarceration. And may those young people told by older people that that's just not possible, may they keep on fighting for change. And may all of you who are midwives of new beginnings find hope and a way forward. May it be so. Amen.